Good morning, everyone. I am very, very sorry for the delays in starting this session, but I am delighted to be joined now by Lord Glasman, who we had a few technical difficulties, which is always the risks of a virtual conference, and it's of course much better to do these things in person for many reasons, not least that one. But I'm delighted that we can now start this session and kick off. So, Maurice, very good to have you here, and thank you for joining us.
Wonderful to be here, and many apologies.
Don't worry at all, Maurice. Don't think of it at all. So, so just a very quick housekeeping rule before we kick off is just to say, because we started this session slightly later than planned, we will run this session, the end of this session, partly in parallel to the next session. So at 9:45 there'll be another session starting on the platform that will be looking at whether or not this is the end or a new beginning for high streets and town centres. That's with Jeremy Hines, Rachel Campbell, John Hoyle and David Rudlin. So feel free to join that session if you want to, but we hope that you'll stay for as much of this session where we'll be looking at the loss of identity and belonging with Lord Glasman. And I'm delighted to have you here, Maurice, because you are someone who's been thinking about these issues for many years and has been, I think, quite prophetic in lots of your writing and your thinking about the future of community and the importance of belonging and home. You've, of course, spent much of your academic career studying the effects of individualism and the commodification of society. You've called for a return for values of faith, flag and community. And you've done that not just in kind of academic circles, but you've also done it on the ground, working with communities through London Citizens, and now in the House of Lords for the last decade as a Labour peer. And you recently set up the Common Good Foundation, specifically to change that balance between society on the one hand and the market and the state on the other. So thank you so much for joining us today.
It's lovely to be here.
I wanted to start, and we spoke a little bit before this session. I wanted to start with someone who we would have loved to be here today. And I think if he had been alive today, he would have been one of the keynote speakers for this conference, a great friend of yours, Sir Roger Scruton, who very sadly passed away in the beginning of this year. Maurice, it's very interesting to me that both you and Roger, so you and Roger were great friends, and you actually, in many respects, had quite similar views of the world or similar values and beliefs that underpinned lots of your writing, but you come from very different political traditions. You're of the left traditionally, and Sir Roger was a stalwart conservative. Can you tell me a little bit about so your friendship with Roger, but then also your differing beliefs, what united your beliefs, and whether there were any areas of difference or disagreement?
Yeah. I miss him every day. I would say that I'm very interested in conservatism. I'm very interested in what it means, attachment, belonging. With Roger, there was this very intense engagement on the meaning of home, on having a home in the world. He had this thing of oikophilia. So the essential argument between us was I saw the market as a very disruptive force of community, as turning individuals into commodities, of disrupting attachment, of moving people around, of maximization of profit and minimization of humanity, if you like. And that was the central thing that we talked about. And it was particularly in relation to housing and homes, the way that either the state or the market took control and society was increasingly disintegrated between those two forces. What I would say is that by the end of his life, we'd reached a great accommodation on this. He was quite skeptical about market-led reforms. He was into self-build. He got into community land trusts. He got into communities having power over developers and holding local authorities accountable. So it was a living friendship, and the conversation was alive, and therefore I feel his loss all the more intensely.
As we all do, and I think his the kind of shadow of his intellectual achievement is cast over this entire conference. Actually, I think lots of the conversations that we've been having yesterday, today, and will do tomorrow touch on lots of things that he wrote about over a long period of time. And as you say, he is much missed. So you mentioned that wonderful phrase or word that he uses, oikophilia, the love of the home. In some ways, that was he directly contrasted that to oikophobia, what he termed the kind of slightly adolescent view of kind of rejection of the home and rejection of cultural habits and traditions and the things which root us, which he saw as being, in some ways, the kind of dominant mode of communicating narrative from politicians and commentators. Do you think that that's still the case? Do you still see oikophobia kind of dominating our politics? And I ask that particularly on a day like today when Keir Starmer is addressing the Labour Party conference, and there's it seems to be a kind of a shift towards a more politics of rootedness and belonging.
Yeah, I think we're really living through that change. I think that's in a large part of what Brexit was about having some kind of accountability that was rooted in a particular community through democracy. Look, we're on the move. We've had 40 years of liberal globalization where it didn't matter where you lived, it didn't matter where you were, it didn't matter who you were, as long as you had an internet connection, which I'm not proud to say I didn't have this morning, which is why I'm late. So let's make a small virtue of that. And liberal globalization is based on the price system fundamentally. So the free movement of labor, free movement of goods, services, money. So it's a relentless attack on place. It's a relentless attack on tradition and belonging. And then you have the state, and the state is almost obliged to think quite abstractly and universally. So there's been a complete erosion of the capacity of people living locally to have any power and to shape things. And this has been substantially rejected. So what you see is we've got a government which is now obviously deep in crisis and confusion over lockdown or work. So but they were elected to have some regionally targeted Keynesianism to revive abandoned towns. And that was a central part of their appeal and their agenda. And now my party, Labour, is beginning to realise that human beings are embodied and embedded beings. We are social beings. We find the meaning of our life in our relationships, our attachment, and our sense of contribution to the people around us. And that is how we wish to be judged. So it's a very, very big battle. What's astonishing is the durability of those sentiments of home, those sentiments of belonging. And whoever can grasp that and resist this overwhelming power of money and the state to move them around and boss them around will emerge. But we're in that period where that politics is now being articulated again, probably for the first time for 40 years. I can't hear you.
Sorry, I was on mute. And can I ask? So, I want to come to the pandemic in a moment and how that's potentially affected some of these big trends, because it feels to me like it could have a really disruptive effect on some of the ways in which we've lived for many years. But before we do, can I ask just some of the trends that you describe, the kind of globalization, the price system, as you say, the kind of global movement of products and labor.
And a state that's centralized,
Yes.
so it can't respond as well. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. I mean, those things are now deeply embedded, and they are to a large degree, part of modern life. How real do you think some of that rhetorical shift that we're seeing in our politics is? Do you think that, I mean, it feels to me that politicians have started talking the language of belonging, but they haven't yet really started to articulate a set of policies that could affect such a significant shift.
So Will, this is the issue. This can't be remedied by policies. There's got to be a new institutional system.
Okay. Right.
Let's that, very briefly, a new body politic. We've got to renew our polity. And the paradox is that with sovereignty, we also have to decentralize. That gives us the power to decentralize. So that's what's at stake. I'll just go through three of the new institutions that are required. The first is to understand that capital money centralizes every bit as much as the state. So what we've seen is the complete disintegration of the building societies, the credit unions, the concentration of capital in the City of London. So I think it's essential to endow regional banks so that local economies can have some access to capital and begin to build. And that links up with the whole discussion that COVID has generated about supply chains and local supply chains. Yeah. That's a vital component. A second one, which I've looked at too, in some ways, is that we put all our money on universities as the instrument of social mobility and transformation, but they're in a huge financial crisis. So I would transform a third of those universities into local vocational colleges. So the dignity of labour, the importance of work, that links up with the supply chains. And then we should also think about, we've had the nationalisation of utilities, we've had the privatisation of utilities. These are vital things: water, electricity, gas. The local trusts, they should be endowed in local trusts accountable to local people. So until we can begin to imagine a new institutional polity, this will remain, as you say, rhetorical, but that's the move we've got to make, and that's what I'm engaged with.
And so that makes total sense. I guess the question I have is, how do we start that process? So who founds those local institutions? Is that bottom up, or does it rely on some kind of top down endorsement? And so how do we go about that? So how do we move from
so apologies to everybody listening, but I'm going to say very early in the morning that it's got to be dialectical. I think there's got to be some conception from the government not to pursue a centralized state model in the economy and also in governance. So it has to have some conception of a body politic. That's why I've been very interested in the Tudor period, where they endowed local institutions, the county system, the city charters, the grammar schools, the endowment of the Oxbridge colleges, the Royal Exchange in London, the Greenwich Naval Academy. These were not state-controlled institutions. These were endowed. So it's part of our tradition, what we could call the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth tradition. So there's got to be an acknowledgement state, but also the other side of the work is local community organising. So, for example, on housing, if there's going to be an alternative to either gated communities, the property developers, or just council house building, then there's got to be a demand from the community for the transfer of land. Those are the community land trusts. And that has to be in partnership with the state and property developers, but have a genuine controlling voice for local communities in the design of their homes and in how they're embedded. And that links right back to the conversations with Roger before he died. That was the area we were really engaging with. So do you see, Will, the key thing is, this is a big change. It doesn't happen very often. We could say 1945 was a big one that emerged out of the war economy and the central planning and the nationalisation model. That all made sense. And then we had the New Right and the Thatcher move, and that was essentially the privatisation of those things. And we've reached a really serious end of the road now. This is the third big transformation. And it's got to be about society and the strengthening. So if the first model, the 45 model, was the state, and the second model, the 79 model, was the market, now it's the time for society, and this is what I'm really engaged with.
So that makes complete sense, and thank you for spelling it out, Maurice. So that's actually a useful segue to move on to the pandemic, because in some ways, Well, I'd be interested, without me, I'm not going to preload the question. I'd be interested in what you think the effect of the pandemic has been. Has it been to kind of expose and reveal a deep well of kind of human kindness and mutual support that people had thought had been lost? Or has it been to reinforce the overwhelming power of the state and actually to increase some of the anomie and isolation that had been in society? I don't know what your view has been on this.
Okay, so once again, I'm going to use that very bad word. It's dialectical. There's both
Right.
trends going on simultaneously, and that's what makes this period very frightening and unpleasant. So, before the pandemic, and in the first 6 to 7 weeks, I would say that it reinforced the three general trends that we've been talking about. So the first is, the move away from globalization, an increased role for the nation state. That was certainly apparent. I mean, that's been apparent for a while, but that became apparent as the state in every country put up the borders, took a lead on leading the response. The second is that an increased importance and recognition of working class. In those first few weeks, there was the clap for the NHS, but there was also recognition that the truck drivers and the shelf stackers, and bear in mind that for 40 years we've really called them the left behind, and there's been a despising of working class, and that was that reinforced that change. And the third thing is that we were actually stuck in the places that we live in, and the importance of place and of neighbours, which was strange because of the isolation we were in. Those are three very significant moves that form one side of this. But the other side, which is increasingly apparent as we've gone on, is that we're aware of the economic might of China, and a country with neither liberty nor democracy, which is extremely inhumane. We've also seen the consolidation of power of the internet oligarchs, of Amazon. I mean, Jeff Bezos made £8 billion in one day. So the disintegration of the local business, disintegration of local shops, is a very, very significant part of this, and a general dehumanization of social relationships. I mean, we can't meet, we can't talk. I mean, really and truly, we should have been together today, and talking about this with real human presence. So what you see, Will, is a simultaneous two opposing forces clashing. On the one side, greater respect for the working class, greater importance for politics and place. On the other side, increasing domination of the market and of politics by the internet, by oligarchs, and by tyranny. So here we are. This is where we are. So it's vital that we understand this and work through it, and develop a politics that strengthens place, the working class, and politics, and above all, defends our inheritance of democracy and liberty, when you can see the possibility of them being of no importance as health and safety and procedural matters dominate. So I think there's a reason why so many of us are troubled and anxious. We thought we'd resolved it, but it's still in the balance.
And are there things that we can do? So obviously, you've articulated a very cogent vision for where we need to get to. But are there? I mean, we're in the midst of the pandemic. It feels to me that during the first lockdown, and we're about to enter the second, there was a kind of realization, including amongst politicians, that civic society, communities themselves, kind of neighbours in the form of mutual aid groups and the like, were actually doing extraordinary work on the ground and actually filling a gap that otherwise the state probably would have had to fill. But government didn't necessarily do a huge amount to support or encourage that. It just happened spontaneously. There is, I think, a growing worry that won't be here for the second time around, as we now potentially go into another form of lockdown. Are there things that whether it's politicians or mayors or community leaders, are there things that people should be doing to try and revive and restore some of that community spirit that we saw in March? Are there, I mean, from your community organising days, are there things that we need to be thinking about to encourage some of that activity now, or or should we as citizens just be taking the initiative and doing it ourselves? I mean, how much can we rely on spontaneity to drive that type of shift?
Well, only where there's a way is there a will. So I think there was an initial, very strong notion of solidarity that came, and people caring for their neighbours. What we're seeing now is that morphing into a general sense of anxiety. So it's vital to maintain those relationships. But above all, Will, somehow or other, we've got to find a way of doing local politics here. We've got to find a way of coming together and pushing towards, well, how are things going to be improved here? What's this third transformation, this discovery of society, how does it work? And I think this is a moment to genuinely get together and think about housing and how to improve the housing stock, and also forms of local accountability. So it's not just about delivering meals. That's a very important thing, but it really is about how to maintain and strengthen local relationships and resist isolation. So obviously, I think that the state has really silly in it the lab system and the bypassing of local authorities and an almost willful statist refusal to engage with local communities and institutions. That's got to change as we realise that this isn't a temporary phenomena. This is the birth pangs of the new, and so it's absolutely incumbent upon all of us to engage with this new politics that's based on relationships, local solidarity, and the building of common institutions. I mean, so the way that I phrase this is we've got to move from contract to covenant. We've got to have binding institutions and intergenerational that views the land as a partner, that views our neighbours as partners in the building of an ethical life. That's the way. So this is a very profound moment in that regard. And what you see is that obviously the pressure on government is a permanent crisis management. It's just a permanent state of crisis. But in fact, we're going to have to live with this pandemic and build, if you like, a parallel polity. So what we saw was that we had no civic immune system. There was just the state, debt, and the NHS. This is a frightening prospect. So, well, the work is right before us, and that's what I think.
Thank you very much. I think we're going to have to end in a couple of minutes, but before we do, I just wanted to ask you a very direct question, which is how do we help people regain some of that sense of identity and belonging? And I'm thinking especially of some of those post-industrial towns or coastal communities, often in the north or in the Midlands, but also in South Wales and parts of Northern Ireland too, especially, where the kind of social fabric of those places has deteriorated over time, and people no longer have a pride of place that they used to have. We found in one of our polls that 7 in 10 people feel like community has declined in their lifetime. How should we think about regaining some of that sense of belonging? What are the most important things that we need to do?
Well, it won't come as a surprise to you. All of those places have lost their assets. They've lost their institutions. I was talking to people in Hartlepool 3 or 4 weeks ago, and their last surviving institutions, which was their A&E and sixth form college, are being moved out. So they're bereft. So when you say they've lost their pride of place, there's also a massive sense of dispossession, of rage at the way that their town has been decimated. So there's an institutional aspect which is vital, and then they've been denuded of capital, of money, of investment. So that's where the banks come in, allow people to, and give people the chance to do things and to build things, and then there's the degradation of work. You know, we know about it, the gig economy and all the other aspects. So that there's got to be a dignity of labour. That's partly the vocational colleges, partly that's living wage, partly that's revival of unions. And then there's got to be the capacity to actually make decisions in those places. And if there's an institutional ecology based on the local banks, based on the vocational colleges, based on schools, based on associations of businesses, then there can be a relationship between them that can generate a genuine sense. This is the thing with belonging. It's not abstract. It's real. And if there's nothing to belong to, other than sentiment, so that's why it's vital that we look at the redistribution of capital, the dignity of labour, the integrity of society, the power of the political institutions. That's the rediscovery of the social and of society, and you know, that's the covenant. They feel that their covenantal promise has been broken, that they've just been abandoned and left to fend for themselves, and that's the thing that's got to really change.
Maurice, thank you so much. That's I do think that that's an incredibly profound thought that does meet the moment that we're in. I feel like this moment has been coming for some time. The pandemic has, to some extent, accelerated some of the trends, but the election in December last year, some of the kind of realignment of British politics all reflect much of what you're saying. And I suspect that the next 5 or 10 years will be spent trying to grapple with some of these issues and trying to affect at least some of what you're saying. So thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you, and I'm looking forward to working together because the work is ahead. So
it is. And I think crucially, it's not a partisan endeavour. It's something that crosses party lines. It's something that people can relate to, irrespective of their political backgrounds.
It's about social and national renewal. This is where we are. So, and please, people, if you've got any questions, let me know. If you want to be in touch, and Will, thank you for having me. And apologies for the technical difficulties at the beginning.
Not at all. It is a risk of hosting things online. But Maurice, thank you so much. Really appreciate you joining us. And everyone, you can now go back to the main forum of the conference by clicking the little red door and join the other session, which is currently happening by clicking on that link. Maurice, thank you so much.
Thank you, Will.
Speak soon.
See you soon.